All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next lecture in our chapter 3 and 4 notes. And we're going to go ahead and now look at how energy is going to flow throughout an ecosystem. So first off, when we look at energy, energy is simply going to be moving in only one direction. And look at the arrows below, and that's going to show that direction. So we're initially starting at the sun. The energy from the sun is going to go to our producers. Then the energy from the producers is going to go to our consumers. Okay, so when we look at those arrows, the arrows are showing the direction in which the energy is flowing. So it goes from the sun, then to the producer, then from the producer, that energy is going to go to the consumer. Okay, so again, it's very important that you watch those arrows and they only go in one direction, and the direction that they go is where the energy is going. All right, now one way we can go ahead and represent our energy flow in an ecosystem is using a food chain. A food chain is simply a model that shows how matter and energy are moving through an ecosystem. Okay, so we can go ahead and look at how nutrients and energy move from our autotrophs to our heterotrophs and eventually to our decomposers when either an autotroph or a heterotroph die. So this here is an example of a very simple food chain. And we're just showing again that all that energy initially starts with the sun. Okay, and then that energy from the sun is going to go to our producers or our autotrophs. The energy that is stored within the autotrophs from them doing photosynthesis, that energy is then going to be going to our first consumers, okay, or our herbivores, those that are going to be eating those plants. And then the energy stored in those organisms are going to go to our next level of consumers, those that would be eating meat. Okay, and a food chain again is just a simple model showing one feeding relationship, that the zebra is eating the grasses and the lion is going to be eating the zebra. So it's just showing one simple feeding relationship and where that energy is moving from organism to organism in our ecosystem. Now, when we look at a food chain, okay, again, we're using those arrows. So take note, the arrows are going in only one direction. You don't see them going any other way other than from left to right. And that is showing where the energy is being transferred. So from the sun to the grass, from the grass to the zebra, and from the zebra to the lion. Okay, those arrows are going from the direction of where the sun is coming from and who it's going to next. Now, another thing that we can look at when we look at a food chain are the trophic levels. So when we talk about a trophic level, we're simply talking about the organism that is in that feeding step. Okay, every feeding step is a trophic level, and we can go ahead and we can number our trophic levels. We can go ahead and put our first, our second, our third, our fourth, however many feeding steps there are along that food chain. Each feeding step is a trophic level. So when we look at these food chains over here, okay, our first organism in the food chain is our plant. That's always going to be our producer. And then we see that our energy from that plant is going to go up to our herbivore. And then from that level, the energy that is held within the herbivore is going to go up to the carnivore. The energy in this carnivore is going to go up into the next level carnivore. And lastly, that carnivore, its energy will go to our top carnivore or our top consumer. So when we look at that food chain, we could go ahead and say that this is our first trophic level. This is our second trophic level, our third trophic level, our fourth trophic level, and our fifth trophic level. So we could say that that whole food chain has 5 trophic levels. It has 5 feeding steps. Now, another way that we can label our food chains is what type of organism they are. Okay, so we always go ahead and we start with our producers. So our first organism in our food chain is always going to be a producer. Okay. Then when we start looking at our consumers, we can label our consumers with what order they are coming in in the food chain. So first consumer, second consumer, third consumer, fourth consumer. So when we look at these labels, okay, we have our first consumer or primary consumer. Then we have our secondary or second consumer. Then we have our tertiary. Tertiary means third consumer. And lastly, we have our fourth or our quaternary consumer. Okay, so we could go ahead and ask you a lot of different questions about what organism is the second consumer, and you would then have to go ahead and look at where your consumers begin and count 1, 2. So the mouse would be our second consumer. I could also go ahead and ask you what organism is in the fourth trophic level. And if we're going to ask that, we have to make sure we understand that we're going to go ahead and start counting at the producer. This is our first trophic level, our second, our third, our fourth. So the snake would be at our fourth trophic level. So you need to go ahead and make sure you're looking at vocab words and what it's asking you. Is it asking you a certain level of consumer? And if that's the case, you're not going to start counting until the actual consumers are listed, because the producers don't count. If it's asking you about a trophic level, that's going to be starting right at the initial part of the food chain at the producers. Okay, so trophic levels are those feeding steps, and just kind of some different ways we can label our food chains and answer some questions about it. All right, now we can go ahead and get a little bit more complex. So instead of just showing a single food chain, we can go ahead and represent a food web. And a food web is going to show all of the possible feeding relationships at each trophic level in that community. Okay, so if you think about yourself, you're simply not going to just be eating one food source. You're going to have multiple food sources. So when we look at a food web, we're going to look at what is everything those organisms are consuming to get their energy. They aren't simply just consuming snakes. They're going to be consuming snakes and coyotes and birds and things like that. So we have to look at what are all the feeding relationships at each of those levels within a community. So it gets much more complex when we start putting together a food web. So if we look at this food web here, okay, we can go ahead and simply, okay, let's look at the eagle. Okay, our eagle is going to be a top consumer. And if we go ahead and look at who that eagle is getting energy from, so if we look at who the arrows are coming to, where the eagle is, okay, the eagle is going to be getting energy from this bird, the thrush, energy going to the eagle. This arrow, if we follow it down, the eagle is going to be eating frogs. This arrow here, we follow it, the eagle could be eating a wolf. This arrow here, follow it, the eagle would be eating rats. And this arrow here, we follow it back, and the eagle could be eating pythons. So instead of showing just a simple food chain of the eagle only eating the python, in a food web, we're going to see that the eagle is simply getting its energy from a lot of different sources. Okay, and again, it's the same thing for ourselves. We aren't simply just eating chicken. We're going to be pulling our energy in from a lot of different food sources. So we want to go ahead and look at those interactions and see how we're getting our energy amongst those different organisms in the community. Now, when we look at food webs, really what we're doing is we're simply linking together a bunch of different food chains for that community. And when we look at those food chains and we look at those food webs, they don't always show our decomposers and our detritivores, but they really play a key role in the entire community. When we look at our decomposers and our detritivores, really what they're doing is they're helping break down all dead and decaying organisms. So it doesn't matter whether or not it's a producer that dies or if it is a consumer that dies, those decomposers and those detritivores are going to break down all of that dead and decaying material so that we can return those nutrients back to the soil for then our producers to be able to take up again. So when we look at a food chain here, okay, we have our producer, its energy is going to the herbivore, our herbivore is giving its energy to the omnivore, omnivore is giving its energy to the carnivore, carnivore is giving its energy to the top carnivore. Okay, but when any of these things die, their energy is going to be given to our decomposers. Right? Anytime any of these organisms die, the energy is going to be given to those decomposers and those detritivores, and they're going to go ahead and break that dead material down, and it's going to be brought into smaller nutrients to go to the soil for then our producers to be able to pick up again. Okay. Our producers are going to be able to pick up those nutrients from the soil to go ahead and allow themselves to grow and get energy as well through their photosynthesis. Okay, so decomposers and detritivores really do play a big role in our food chains. It's just that they're not always shown in that food chain, because realistically, every single organism is going to give energy to those decomposers once they die. All right, now another thing we're going to look at is how a disturbance in a food web can affect an entire community. So if there's a disturbance in a food web, okay, what we're talking about is an organism within that food web, something might happen to its population. So there might be a disease that goes throughout that population that causes that population to decrease. There might be some type of drought that causes those producers to not be able to survive. They could have a large group of that population leave that community and go elsewhere. So when we're talking about a disturbance, we're talking about something happening to the population in that community. And really what happens then is it gives this kind of domino effect, and it really has substantial effects then on the entire food web. Okay, so if we go ahead and we look, let's say we look at this bird, the anhinga. Okay, and let's say that some disease or something occurs that causes that population of bird to greatly decrease. Okay, well, that's going to really have a large effect on a lot of organisms inside of this food web. Okay, so if we go ahead and we look, okay, the anhinga, okay, who it's getting its energy from. So who is the anhinga eating? So we get this arrow here, it's going to be eating the largemouth bass. It's going to be eating this killfish. It's going to be eating these crayfish, these frogs. Okay, so here's its food sources. Now, because the anhinga population has decreased so much, it's not going to be eating these foods, and therefore then their populations are likely going to be increasing. Okay, because they don't have one of their predators eating them, so they're not going to be decreasing or staying in balance, and we're going to see an increase in their population numbers. Now, why that's a problem? If we go further back in that food web, okay, and now let's look at, well, what is the largemouth bass eating? Okay, because if its population is going up, there's going to be more of them eating that food source. So if we go back and we look, okay, well, the bass is eating this flagfish, and it is eating the grass shrimp and the worms. Well, because their population increased so much because the anhinga isn't there hunting them, now we're going to have a problem because we're going to have so many bass. The flagfish are going to be getting eaten more, so their numbers are going to be decreasing, and as well as the grass shrimp and worms, their numbers are going to be decreasing. Okay. Same thing if we go ahead and we look at the killfish. Killfish also eat grass, shrimp, and worms. So if their numbers are going up because they're not getting hunted by an anhinga, then their numbers are going to decrease even more. Okay, so we have to go ahead and look at kind of how that affects everybody. So just because the anhinga numbers go down because there's a disease or they are hunted, they are overhunted, then because their numbers go down, it's going to affect who they typically eat, and their numbers are going to start increasing. But then because their numbers are increasing, whoever they are eating for their food source and their energy, their numbers are going to go ahead and start decreasing. Okay, so it really kind of has this domino effect where everybody in the community, everybody in that food web is going to be affected some way or another when just one organism in that food web has a disturbance. All right, now something else that we can go ahead and use to go ahead and represent what's going on in our communities. So we have food webs, we have food chains. We can also go ahead and use what are called ecological pyramids. So ecological pyramids are simply an illustration that we go ahead and use to show relative amounts of energy or matter that are at each trophic level. So one, it's an illustration. It's going to look like a pyramid, and it's going to be showing how much energy or how much matter we have at each feeding step. Now, when we look at these pyramids, the first trophic level is always going to be our producers. Okay, they are always going to be that very first feeding step, just like when we look at a food chain or a food web, they're always at that first level. Okay, the producers are always at the bottom. So when we look at an ecological pyramid, at the bottom, we're going to always have our producers, and then we're going to go up in our different types of consumers as we move up that pyramid. Okay, wider base at the bottom typically, smaller at the top. Now there's three different types of pyramids we're going to go ahead and look at. We're going to go ahead and look at pyramid of energy, pyramid of biomass, and pyramid of numbers. So first one is pyramid of energy, and this one is I would say more used than the other two, but pyramid of energy is simply showing how much energy we have available at each of those trophic levels or each of those feeding steps. Now, big thing to remember is only about 10% of the energy is actually going to get transferred from one trophic level to the next. Okay. The other 90% of the energy is going to be lost as heat, and it's going to be lost as energy needed just for simple life processes. Okay. So when we look at a pyramid of energy, again, our producers are always at the bottom. Okay. And they're going to be having 100% of that energy. Okay. They're doing photosynthesis, they're getting the energy from the sun. They're going to have 100% of the energy. However, when our herbivores start eating those producers, okay, 100% of the energy does not go to the herbivores. Okay. Only 10% does. The other 90% is going to be lost by the producers having to do all the things that they have to do in order to stay living. And a lot of the chemical reactions and the life processes create a lot of heat as a byproduct or a waste product. And that heat then gets released off. Okay. And that's energy being released. So when you look at all these arrows, that is showing that thermal energy or that heat that is being lost along the way. Okay, and that heat that's lost is all due to all these different chemical reactions that these organisms are having to do to stay living. Okay, just like ourselves, when we go ahead and produce and use energy, we create a lot of heat and that gets released out of our bodies. Okay, so every time you move up a level, so these herbivores, okay, they are being eaten by the omnivores, they're only going to get 10% of that previous level's energy. Okay, and then our carnivores get even less, and our decomposers get even less. Okay, so there's less and less available energy as we move up that pyramid because, again, only 10% is actually being allowed to go up to the next level. The other 90% is being wasted through heat and life processes. All right, now the next one is pyramid of biomass. And the big key clue here when we're talking about what a pyramid of biomass is the word mass. When we talk about mass, we're talking about the grams of the organisms. Okay, for you guys, what you can relate this to is talking about the weight. Okay, weight and mass are very different. Mass deals along with the gravity as well, pull on Earth. But for you, something to relate to when we're talking about mass, it's similar to talking about the weight of the organisms. So when you look at this type of pyramid, you're always going to see those different categories, and they're going to be listed with how many grams of organisms there are at each level. And what we're looking at how much mass of food is available at each of those trophic levels. Okay, so it's always very wide at the bottom with our producers, and then it gets more and more narrow at the top. So when we look at producers and how much weight, we're going to have a lot more weight in producers or mass. Okay, because you have to think about just how much mass is in all of the trees and the grasses and the flowers. There are a lot of mass there. Then when we go up to our next feeding step and we talk about our herbivores, we're going to go ahead and see that number is going to decrease some because we don't have as many herbivores, okay, as we do producers. And then as we go up each level, that mass is going to continue to decrease. Okay, we definitely cannot have as many top carnivores because what they're having to consume below to go ahead and get enough energy, we can't sustain having too many carnivores because there isn't enough energy and they would be eating then everything below them. All right, our last pyramid is the pyramid of numbers. And just like it sounds, we're dealing with numbers. So we're simply showing the number of organisms at each of those levels. So we're just counting up how many total producers do we have, how many total herbivores do we have, etc. We're just going ahead and we're counting them up. So when we look here, we would see, well, in this community, there's 100,000 leaves. Next level, we have 10,000 caterpillars. Next level, we have 100 blue jays, and so on. And again, you're always going to see at the very top, those very top consumers, there's going to be fewer of them because of what they're having to eat to get enough energy to survive is going to have to be much less. Okay, so they're going to have to go ahead and consume way, way, way more to get the energy they need. And therefore, we can't have a whole lot of top carnivores. Otherwise, all of our organisms below would go extinct. They'd eat them all. Now, one thing that's very interesting is when we look at a pyramid of numbers, it isn't always going to be a typical pyramid. Sometimes it's going to have a diamond shape. And that is because sometimes our herbivore number is higher than our producer number. Okay, so when we go ahead and we count up how many trees we have, we might not have as many trees as we do the number of herbivores, because for herbivores, we have to go ahead and include all the insects, all the birds. So there sometimes are higher numbers of herbivores, which causes this wider part in the middle and the narrower part for our producers. So sometimes our pyramid of numbers gives this kind of diamond shape to it. Okay. All right, guys, that should be about it for our lecture for today. So we have our different ecological pyramids. We have food chains and food webs and trophic levels. And we also have how disturbances in a food web can affect a whole community. So make sure you guys have taken good notes and ask any questions that you might have.